As the saying goes, history is written by the winners, and the winners ain't going to give us an unbiased account, which means the historian's job is to study historical documents and try and separate the facts from the fiction, much to the chagrin of apologists. Hey there, folks. Bertram the Barely Bearable Atheist here, continuing our series on the book On Guard by Dr. William Lane Craig. We's up to another chapter entitled Personal Interlude, A Philosopher's Journey of Faith, only this one's labeled as being Part 2. The interlude he labeled as Part 1 was all about how he managed to get a PhD in philosophy through the generosity of others. And he followed that up with 4 chapters of apologetics using philosophy to try and prove God's existence. Well, interlude number 2 is all about how he managed to get a PhD in theology through the generosity of others, with a specialization in studying the historicity of Jesus. And the next 3 chapters is going to be theological arguments trying to prove that the Gospels is historically accurate. So basically, this book is Dr. Craig saying, I'm an expert in philosophy, and here's a bunch of philosophical arguments, and I'm also an expert in theology, and here's a bunch of theological arguments. And I reckon that's reasonable. Focus on what you know, or at least what you think you know. There was some interesting stuff in the first interlude, so I covered that in some detail, but the second one don't really have much of counter-apologetic interest. He hypes up the problems he faced trying to get into the PhD program he wanted so's he could make it look like God must have done something supernatural to get him in, but there ain't nothing there that would particularly require any miraculous interventions. He took some chances and they paid off, and now he's double Dr. William Lane Craig. That's just how life works sometimes. So anyways, I think that's all that needs to be said about interlude number 2, and we can go on ahead and dig into chapter 8, entitled, Who Was Jesus? And to look at the church today, it looks like the answer is, well, who do you want him to be? To listen to the Westboro Baptist Church, he's a first-class hater who's going to be absolutely delighted to send most folks to an eternity of screaming and agony in hell. To listen to right-wing extremists, he's a former refugee who wants to turn America into a fascist dictatorship that persecutes refugees along with LGBT plus folks and liberals and educated folks and scientists and on and on and on. And, of course, if you listen to some of the more liberal believers, he's the embodiment of compassion and tolerance and care for the sick, the needy, and the elderly. Or in other words, he's what right-wingers call woke. And that's just a broad overview. At a more personal level, there's more varieties of Jesus than there is Pokemon. And some folks has more than one at the same time. So it's going to be interesting to hear Dr. Craig give his own personal answer to who Jesus is supposed to be. He starts off with a story about how in the mid-1970s he heard about a forthcoming book entitled The Myth of God Incarnate, in which a team of Bible scholars assembled by Professor John Hick set out to prove that Jesus never claimed to be divine and that the whole incarnation story was a myth. And that ain't too surprising to hear from modern scholarship, but what is surprising is that this is the same Professor John Hick that Dr. Craig was talking about in interlude number 1 as being the scholar that he wanted to study under and who was the advisor for his first doctoral dissertation. So it sounds like there's more to the story than what Dr. Craig has been telling us in these 2 interludes. Anyways, Dr. Craig weren't too keen on hearing about this book about the incarnation being a myth. Quote, I remember feeling irritated and frustrated. Why don't our New Testament scholars answer this stuff, I thought. Why does it go unchallenged in the press? End quote. And I had similar thoughts and feelings in the 1970s as an evangelical Christian myself. But over time, I started asking some related questions that Dr. Craig didn't ask, even though maybe he should have. Never mind New Testament scholars, why didn't Jesus himself just show up in real life and prove them all wrong? Does he really want us to know for sure that he exists and that he's really God? I mean, that's the whole point of preaching and apologetics after all. And this is the apologist's unsolvable dilemma. If Jesus does want us to be able to know for sure that it's all true, then he ought to give us what we need in order to know for sure. He ought to show up in real life. That'd settle it. But if he don't want us to know, then preaching and apologetics is a waste of time at best. It might even be an outright lie claiming that God has given us evidence that he ain't actually given us. Now, you could say that it's because he wants us to have faith instead of certainty, but that's an even bigger problem because he ain't here for us to put our faith in. The closest we can come is put our faith in the folks that tell stories about him, believing what they says just because they says so. But that ain't faith in God, that's faith in the storytellers, and the stories contradict each other. So we can't have faith in God. The best we can have is gullibility. That's a problem. Of course, Dr. Craig ain't going to bring any of that up. He'd rather have us think that there's a new David getting ready to battle the Goliath of modern scholarship. Quote, a veritable revolution in New Testament scholarship was transpiring that would soon reverse such skepticism and establish the Gospels as historically credible sources for the life and claims of Jesus. End quote. Ain't that interesting? Apparently, according to Dr. Craig, there's been some kind of game-changing discoveries that's occurred between the mid-1970s and 2010 when this book was written. And according to Dr. Craig, the result has been that, quote, radical critics are being increasingly marginalized within the academy as scholarship has come to a new appreciation of the historical reliability of the New Testament documents. End quote. Golly gee willikers, that sounds amazing. I can't wait to find out what new discoveries has overturned all modern biblical scholarship and destroyed the careers of folks like Dr. Bart Ehrman and Dr. James Tabor and similar. What do you suppose these groundbreaking discoveries could be? Quote, in the next 2 chapters, we want to look at some of the evidence that will enable you to make a case for the radical personal claims and resurrection of Jesus, and so for faith in him. End quote. So we don't say nothing about what these new discoveries is supposed to be, and that's disappointing. I expected him at the very least to give us the names of some of the scholars that's doing this supposedly revolutionary new scholarship. So was this just hype to pump up enthusiasm for the next 2 chapters? I reckon we'll find out. Dr. Craig continues with what he calls setting the stage. Quote, an event like Jesus' resurrection must be explored in its historical context if we're to understand it correctly. End quote. And that's partly correct with one caveat. We ain't got no resurrected Jesus here, so we ain't exploring no actual resurrection. Dr. Craig is talking like the resurrection is an already established fact, but in the context of this discussion, that's just circular reasoning, because the resurrection is what he's trying to prove. Instead, what we've actually got here is just a story about Jesus supposedly resurrected. So what we need to understand is how that story came about. And in order to do that, yes, we do need to look at the story in its historical context. Dr. Craig is correct about that part, at least. But then he goes on, quote, so what is the proper context for understanding Jesus' resurrection? It is Jesus' own unparalleled life and claims, end quote. And here's where Dr. Craig takes a sharp turn away from sound historical scholarship. The story of Jesus' alleged life and claims is part of the same story as the story of his supposed resurrection. That is the literary context, not the historical context. And like Dr. Craig started out by saying, it's the historical context that's essential here. We has a collection of ancient literary narratives, and we need to understand them in terms of their historical context. We can't just substitute in the literary context as if it was the historical context. We need to understand the history and culture of the society that produced the stories. For example, it's extremely important to understand that in first century Palestine there was widespread belief in dreams and visions as being authentic manifestations of God and angels and such. And we see this in various places in the New Testament. For example, in Matthew chapter 1, verses 18 and following, we read that Joseph was going to quietly divorce Mary after he found out she was pregnant with someone else's kid. But then an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream and told him not to do that. And notice, Joseph don't say, "Man, that was a weird dream." He goes on ahead and marries her. As far as he was concerned, it weren't just a dream, it was an authentic manifestation of an actual angel from God. And there's lots of other places where it says that God spoke to folks in a dream, but the one phrase you won't find anywhere in the New Testament is the phrase, "It was just a dream." And that's important because if you was a first century believer and you had a dream where you saw a resurrected Jesus, you wouldn't say, "I had a strange dream." You'd say that Jesus himself had genuinely appeared to you. And maybe you'd mention that it happened in a dream, or maybe you wouldn't. Or maybe someone else would write down your story and just leave out the part about it being a dream. Because as far as first century believers was concerned, the important thing was that Jesus really did appear to you, and not the details about how he chose to appear. Same for visions. If you had a vision of the Lord or of an angel of the Lord or whatever, folks didn't say you was just hallucinating. I mean, I'm sure there was skeptics even back then that didn't buy it, but then the skeptics didn't become believers neither. The first century believers bought into that stuff, and you can read about it all through the Bible. That's important because it means that first century believers would accept the validity of experiences that a lot of folks today would regard as being just mundane dreams and hallucinations. Apologists likes to say that nobody would die for a lie, but to first century folks, dreams and visions weren't a lie. And that's a big part of the historical context that we has to keep in mind as we explore the stories that come out of early Palestine. Now, obviously, Dr. Craig ain't going to mention any of that. He wants us to believe that first century Christians left us an accurate record of the things that Jesus taught, even though Jesus himself never wrote nothing down. So he's going to indulge in a little whataboutism. Quote, "The famous Greek philosopher Socrates also left behind no writings of his own. We're dependent upon his disciple Plato for most of our knowledge of Socrates' life and teaching." End quote. And while that's true to a point, there's a couple of important differences between Socrates and Jesus here. First of all, nobody is claiming that Socrates performed miracles and came back from the dead. So his story's already a lot more consistent with what we see in the real world than the story of Jesus is. But secondly, Plato was a first-person witness to the teachings he received in person from Socrates over a long association. And that ain't true of the anonymous authors who wrote the New Testament Gospels decades after the death of Jesus in a language that neither Jesus nor his disciples even spoke. They weren't personally trained by Jesus himself, they was just recording whatever stories happened to go viral in the first century. And viral stories ain't a particularly reliable source of information on account of how memes work. They's prone to embellishment and sensationalism because that's what makes stories go viral. And in that context, Dr. Craig raises a highly relevant question. Quote, "How do we know that these records are accurate? Maybe Jesus' followers said that he said and did certain things he really didn't." End quote. And that's an excellent question with a clear and unambiguous answer. In order to tell whether a given testimony is accurate, it has to pass two tests. First, it has to be consistent with itself, and second, it has to be consistent with what we actually observe in the real world. Objective reality is the ultimate standard of truth, and truth is consistent with itself. So to be true, a story has to be self-consistent and consistent with reality. That's what true means. But that ain't the direction that Dr. Craig is headed. Quote, The writings contained in the New Testament can be scrutinized using the same historical criteria that we use in investigating other sources of ancient history, like Thucydides' Peloponnesian War or the Annals of Tacitus. End quote. And that's true, but there's better examples that we could use here. For example, Plutarch's Lives would be an even better comparison, since it also contains stories of the supernatural, like the story of how the mother of Romulus and Remus supposedly was a virgin who was impregnated by a divine spirit, as well as the story of the apotheosis of Romulus that transformed him into a god. Obviously, historians don't treat ancient stories as if they was either completely true or completely false. They sift through the claims of the story and assign a level of confidence that's proportional to how consistent each individual claim is with itself, with other sources, and with objective reality in general. And that's exactly what we need to do with the New Testament stories, but that ain't what Dr. Craig does. Quote, Jesus of Nazareth is referred to in a range of ancient sources inside and outside the New Testament, including Christian, Roman, and Jewish sources. This is really quite extraordinary when you reflect on how obscure a figure Jesus was. End quote. And here's where the misdirections start to creep in. Dr. Craig makes it sound like Jesus was so famous that even Romans and Jews was talking about him. But this glosses over the fact that whenever non-Christian sources talks about Jesus, they's talking about him in the context of him being the central figure in the Christian religion. In other words, it ain't that Jews and Romans had their own unbiased first-hand observations of Jesus. The Jesus they was talking about was a character in some stories being told by Christians. It's like when you find references to Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster in the writings of folks that don't believe in Bigfoot or the Loch Ness Monster. They ain't independently corroborating the existence of Bigfoot and Nessie, they's just referring to things that the believers is claiming. So given the fact that the Christian religion was growing and interacting with Jewish and Roman society, there ain't nothing remarkable at all in the fact that non-Christians sometimes mentioned the things that Christians was claiming. And that's like being surprised that non-Muslims would mention Muhammad when talking about Islam. And even Dr. Craig admits this, sort of. Quote, the most important of these historical sources have been collected into the New Testament. References to Jesus outside the New Testament tend to confirm what we read in the Gospels, but they don't really tell us anything new. End quote. And obviously, that's because the outside sources is just commenting on what's in the New Testament stories. That ain't corroboration, that's just repetition. But Dr. Craig is trying to make it sound like the Jews and the Romans did their own independent investigation and came to the same conclusions as the Christians did, which that ain't the case at all. Also, notice that Dr. Craig is very careful to always use the term historical sources to refer to the New Testament documents. And technically, that's true in the same way that the Odyssey is a historical source concerning the Trojan War. In other words, it's a list of claims that individually may or may not be true, and it's up to the careful historian to sift through them all and separate the fact from the fiction. What Dr. Craig don't mention is the fact that historians have a bunch of other sources for early Christian beliefs and practices besides the documents that eventually became the New Testament. The New Testament is a classic example of how history is written by the winner, but in the first few centuries, Christianity was anything but monolithic. Some Christians thought Jesus was God, some thought he was a God, some thought he became God, and some thought he was indwelt by God. They all figured there was something divine about him, but they didn't all agree on what. And they disagreed over other things as well, as you can read throughout the New Testament epistles. Paul, for example, was constantly struggling with what he called false teachers, meaning Christians who was teaching stuff that contradicted Paul, and so on. So even as early as the 1st century, Christians was telling different stories about who Jesus was and what he did or did not teach. And not all of them stories is recorded in the New Testament on account of the canon was defined by the winners, thanks to the mingling of church and state. Now contrast that with what Dr. Craig would like us to believe. Quote, many laymen don't understand this procedure. They think that if you examine the New Testament writings themselves rather than look at sources outside the New Testament, then somehow you're reasoning in a circle using the Bible to prove the Bible. End quote. And obviously, since they's just laymen, they must be getting it wrong, right? Quote, but that's not at all what historians are doing when they examine the New Testament. They're treating the New Testament just like any other collection of ancient documents and investigating whether these documents are historically reliable. End quote. And this is partly correct and partly misleading to the point of being outright deceptive. It's true that a historian will treat the New Testament just like any other ancient text. And by the way, when they do, Dr. Craig gets pretty upset over it because they end up treating the supernatural claims in the New Testament the same way they treat similar claims in the Odyssey. And he don't like that. But the misleading part is when he claims that historians is investigating whether or not these documents is historically reliable. And that ain't something an actual historian ever does, on account of that would be downright foolish. Historical documents ain't never 100% true or 100% false. There's going to be a mixture of facts, exaggerations, legends, omissions, boastings, slanders, misunderstandings, and just a whole bunch of stuff. So an actual historian ain't never going to declare that any particular document is 100% reliable. They's going to get into the details and examine each claim individually. They's going to ask, is this consistent with other parts of the same document? Is it consistent with what we can confirm from other sources? Does it describe events that's sharply inconsistent with what we observe in the real world? And so on. And that ain't an approach that's going to do apologists any good at all. Unless you think it'd do any good to tell apologists the truth, of course. But I mean, it ain't going to help them sell their preferred narrative. So what we got going on right here is an attempt by Dr. Craig to subvert the historical method and turn it into something that delivers a predetermined conclusion rather than a reliable one. He wants to use a rigged method to make the claim that the New Testament documents in their entirety is reliable documents. And that is the exact opposite of a correct application of the historical method. And I'm sure there's more that could be said, but that's going to about do it for me for today. Next time, we'll pick up where we left off as Dr. Craig continues his perversion of the historical method in order to get the answers he wants. And I think it's useful to see exactly where and how he subverts the historical method. Meanwhile, thanks for watching, and please be kind wherever possible.